Victor Sims, the Z historian. On Tuesday, March 18, 1975, an explosion occurred at house number 150 Muramba Road, Chimurenga South, Lusaka. The residence at the time was occupied by a Mr. Herbert Chitepo, former national chairman of Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, and a leading personality in the enlarged African National Council, ANC. Chitepo and one of his bodyguards, Selous, died on the spot, and a third person, Sadat Kafumazuba, sustained serious injuries. Also killed by the explosion was a young Zambian boy named Sambwa Chaya, who lived close to Mr. Chitepo's house. On 31st March, President Kenneth Kaunda addressed the nation on both radio and television, announcing the formation of a special commission of inquiry into Herbert Chitepo's assassination. He denounced the killing as a murderous act and labeled those responsible enemies of Zambia and Africa. Yet beneath the firmness of his words lay an unsettling truth. This incident was not a conclusion. It was only a part of a far darker chain of events, one that would expose fractures, secrets, and betrayals far beyond the blast in Lusaka and the borders of Zambia. The assassination of Herbert Chitepo did not erupt from a vacuum. It was a violent interlude in a bitter struggle that began decades earlier with conquest, compromise, and unfinished revolution.
Sir Godfrey Huggins, Prime Minister of Southern Rhodesia, inheriting the great ideas of his country's founder, stresses what the policy of federation means to Central Africa.
And if we are to create a strong, virile, progressive British state in that very large area of Africa, then a federation is the only solution.
In the 1950s, Britain attempted an imperial sleight of hand known as the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. Sold publicly as partnership and multiracial cooperation, the Federation was, in practice, a fortress for white settler power. And Africans saw straight through the illusion almost immediately. To them, the Federation was not about unity. It was a consolidation of domination, an unholy alliance. And while its architects promised gradual progress, its African victims experienced accelerated repression. African nationalism surged in response. Across southern Rhodesia, political movements hardened into resistance, then resistance into revolution. Parties were formed, banned, reborn, and banned again. Movements such as the Southern Rhodesia African National Congress, the National Democratic Party, and the Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, rose and fell under settler pressure. And soon, younger, more impatient nationalists began asking an uncomfortable question. If politics leads only to prison, what alternative remains? By the early 1960s, the Federation collapsed under the weight of African resistance. Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland became Zambia and Malawi. Two of the three countries were granted independence, but Southern Rhodesia was not. You see, Southern Rhodesia had a large, wealthy, politically entrenched white settler population that already exercised internal self-government. Since 1923, it had effectively governed itself under white minority rule, and the British government's position was firm on one non-negotiable condition: no independence without majority rule. And that's where they hit an impasse. Southern Rhodesia's settler government flatly rejected this condition. To London, granting independence to a regime that permanently excluded the African majority would have meant legitimizing racial minority rule at a time when apartheid South Africa was already an international embarrassment. Britain feared setting a dangerous precedent that would undermine its authority across the empire and inflame African resistance elsewhere. From the settlers' perspective, this felt like betrayal. They believed they had successfully built the Rhodesian economy, developed infrastructure, fought and died in Britain's wars, and in their view, responsibly governed for decades.
There can be any doubt in anybody's mind. We speak from experience. We know what we are talking about. We have been successful because we were virtually independent before we declared our independence. And this is the big failure as far as so many of the countries to the north of us were concerned. They got something by name handed to them on a plate, but in reality, in fact, they didn't have it. They never had it.
Settler leaders increasingly framed the issue not as democracy versus racism, but as civilization versus chaos, warning that African rule would mean economic collapse and violence. And that mindset paved the way for Ian Smith and the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, UDI, in 1965, a unilateral break with Britain designed to preserve white rule indefinitely. This is where Zambia enters the story, not as a bystander, but as a crucible.
It is important for me to underline what our position is on Geneva. We, like the nationalists, believe that the Geneva Conference on the independence of Zimbabwe is the product of the successful armed struggle against the rebel regime of Ian Smith. Without the successive victories of the nationalist forces on the battlefield, Britain and the United States would not have taken the current vigorous initiative which we witness today in trying to end the war by transferring power from the minority to the majority. Consequently, since majority rule has not yet been achieved, the nationalists must continue the war, and we will continue to support them in their intensified armed struggle.
Newly independent and barely finding its own footing, Zambia was thrust into a role it neither sought nor could escape. Geography was destiny. To the south lay an illegal white regime clinging to power. To the north and east, newly liberated African states, and running straight through Zambia's map were the fault lines of unfinished decolonization.
It was during this period that I served in the army, and right from as a lieutenant, as a platoon commander, I was continually deployed on operations facing initially the Portuguese in Angola and in Mozambique.
Liberation movements set up officers, training pipelines, diplomatic missions, and rival camps. Zambia offered sanctuary, but sanctuary came at a price. Each safe house risked retaliation. Each strategic facility risked sabotage. Each convoy risked attack. Ironically, independence had made Zambia not only freer, but far more vulnerable. For settler Rhodesia, Zambia's role was unforgivable. By hosting nationalist movements, Zambia was accused of exporting rebellion, and by refusing to shut them down, it became a target. Rail lines were sabotaged, borders were militarized. The young state that had hoped to focus on schools, roads, and copper mines now found itself defending bridges and power stations. It was within this pressure cooker that Herbert Chitepo arrived. Exile placed him in Lusaka, but exile also placed him at the center of everything else. Something far more deadly, which would eventually lead to his death.
Do you support the use of force to overthrow the present government?
Yes, we do, because no other thing will work. We have tried, we pleaded for conferences, we pleaded for constitutional settlement. All those have never succeeded. The only language they will understand is force, and we intend to use it.
Herbert Chitepo was not only a nationalist leader, he was a convergence point. Born in 1923 at Banda Mission near Nyanga, he embodied a rare fusion of legal intellect, revolutionary discipline, and strategic clarity. As Southern Rhodesia's first African lawyer and later Tanzania's first African director of public prosecutions, he understood the colonial system from the inside, its laws, its weaknesses, and its hypocrisies. When he entered the liberation struggle fully, he brought with him something far more dangerous to the empire than slogans: organizational coherence and strategic intent. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Chitepo had become the principal architect of ZANU's external operations. From Lusaka, he coordinated the armed struggle, oversaw the formation and direction of ZANA, and initiated negotiations with Frelimo to establish rear bases in Mozambique. He rejected détente not as a tactical pause, but as a strategic deception. As he bluntly stated, "We have not been fighting to bring Smith to the talking table, we are fighting for majority rule." It was that very position that placed him on a collision course with almost everyone who had an interest in slowing, reshaping, or controlling the war. One theory is that Chitepo was the victim of internal ethnic rivalries in the liberation movement. To be sure, by 1974, ZANU was riven by power struggles, ethnic mistrust, and military grievances. The Nhari rebellion exposed deep resentment within the ranks. Shortages of food and ammunition, perceptions of favoritism, and anger at movement leaders accused of living in relative comfort in Lusaka. Chitepo, as chairman and external leader, stood at the apex of this resentment. Ironically, his authority made him both indispensable and isolated. The Special International Commission later found that even his own bodyguards acted less as protectors and more as spies, reporting his movements and conversations to the Supreme Political and Military Council of ZANU, responsible for directing the liberation war. For the illegal regime of Ian Smith, Chitepo was a strategic threat of the highest order. Eliminating him promised multiple dividends, decapitate ZANU's external leadership, sow confusion, and, most importantly, make the assassination appear internal. A liberation movement imploding from within was far cheaper than one united against Salisbury. The evidence assembled by David Martin and Phyllis Johnson points directly to this logic. The use of a foreign-trained explosives expert, the planting of PE4, and the careful surveillance of Chitepo's home suggest not factional rage, but professional intelligence work. Rhodesian Central Intelligence Organization planners did not simply want Chitepo dead, they wanted his death to fracture the movement he held together. According to accounts drawn from Peter Stiff's "See You in November" and corroborated by other Rhodesian-era sources, the assassination of Herbert Chitepo was the result of a deliberate external intelligence operation conducted by the CIO. The operation was carried out by former British SAS operatives, notably Hugh Chuck Hind, working alongside Alan Taffy Bryce and a white Zambian farmer, Ian Sutherland. But that's not all. When Chitepo was killed in March 1975, many treated the act as exceptional, even unusual. A single explosion, a single victim, a single moment of catastrophe. But what followed in the years after his death reveals that Chitepo's assassination was not an isolated crime, but an early chapter in a deliberate doctrine of elimination. And this time, the target was the man revered as Father Zimbabwe, Joshua Nkomo. Joshua Nkomo was born on June 19, 1917. From the beginning, he stood for something deeply threatening to colonial powers. Unity across ethnic lines, land equity, and political rights rooted in majority rule. Nkomo's stature as a unifier elevated him beyond factional politics and paradoxically made him dangerous to both the settler regime and hardliners within the nationalist movement. To Rhodesia, he was a strategic threat capable of mobilizing disciplined force through ZIPRA. To extremists on all sides, he was an obstacle, too moderate to control, too popular to ignore. In In September 1978 and February 1979, ZIPRA, the armed wing aligned to Nkomo, shot down Air Rhodesia Vickers Viscount civilian aircraft using Soviet-supplied SAM-7 Strela 2 surface-to-air missile. These were not symbolic acts. They demonstrated something the Rhodesian state feared above all else: that the liberation forces now possess strategic weapons capable of denying airspace. With this act, Salisbury concluded that such resources could only flow through Nkomo's diplomatic networks, particularly his Soviet and Eastern Bloc connections. His stature gave ZIPRA a level of strategic credibility and escalation potential that ZANU and ZANLA had not yet matched. Once that assessment hardened, Nkomo ceased to be a political interlocutor and became a strategic liability. Neutralizing the threat meant neutralizing the man. And by 1978, neutralization no longer meant arrest. It meant something more permanent. And the task fell to the infamous Selous scouts, whose operations were now authorized inside Zambia. The Selous scouts were not simply soldiers, they were a weaponized deception. Formed to fight a war Rhodesia could not win openly, the scouts mastered false flags, impersonation, and psychological warfare, blurring the line between hunter and hunted. Disguised as guerrillas, speaking the languages, wearing the uniforms, and moving among the very communities they targeted, they turned trust into a battlefield. Their operations aimed less at victory than at contamination, sowing suspicion within liberation movements, provoking internecine violence, and making every success feel like a trap. Feared even by allies, denied by patrons, and lethal by design, the Selous scouts embodied a grim truth of the conflict. When a state loses legitimacy, it often doubles down on deniability. And in that shadow war, confusion became strategy, betrayal became method, and fear did as much damage as any bullet. When Nkomo was marked for assassination and the task fell to the Selous scouts, one of the lead men assigned to the mission is said to have been Govt, a man born in Zambia, holding a Zambian passport and therefore invisible in plain sight. His job was simple and lethal: study Nkomo's home, chart the routes from the Zambezi to Lusaka, and map the habits of a man marked for death. Govt embedded himself quietly. He joined the Lusaka Golf Club near Nkomo's residence on Nyerere Drive, steps from the road leading to President Kaunda's State House. From there, he watched. Timings, movements, patterns, surveillance disguised as leisure. Back in Rhodesia, preparation became rehearsal. At Nkomo Barracks, the Selous scouts built a mock-up of Nkomo's Lusaka house. They practiced the assault again and again, and on April 14, 1979, the operation went live. A Rhodesian Special Air Service unit crossed the Zambezi at Kariba by boat under Captain Martin Pierce, guided by Anthony White, who had conducted reconnaissance with Govt. The column rode north in 7 sable Land Rovers painted in Zambian colors, so convincing that Zambian intelligence waved them through, mistaking the convoy as Zambian. In the night of April 15, 1979, Rhodesian Special Forces arrived in Lusaka. The group first attacked the legendary Liberation Center, now the Defense Services Command and Staff College, which hosted liberation movements in the region. Another group of Rhodesian commandos landed at the Lusaka Golf Club and attacked Nkomo's safe house. Joshua Nkomo survived the assassination attempt on his life by sneaking into State House using a back window. Rhodesian special forces were stunned at how a man as big as Nkomo had escaped through a window. When asked later how he survived, his answer was disarmingly simple: "I jumped."
Before we left Geneva, I was interviewed by the members of the security police of Mr. Smith at my hotel. I was told that there is a group of white people here who are organizing to kill me.
However, Rhodesians were not convinced, and suspicion turned to the possibility that he had been tipped off by enemies of Rhodesia. After this attack, President Kaunda decided to have all the liberation movement leaders live at State House. Finally, after 15 years of armed struggle known as the Rhodesian Bush War, prolonged fighting, international sanctions, and regional pressure against Ian Smith's regime led to negotiations in London, culminating in the Lancaster House Agreement, September to December 1979. The Lancaster House Agreement ended the war, imposed a ceasefire, set a new constitutional framework, and paved the way for UN-supervised elections in early 1980. Those elections proved decisive. Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe African National Union, Patriotic Front, secured a clear majority with strong backing from Shona-speaking regions, while Joshua Nkomo's Patriotic Front, ZAPU, dominated Matabele land. On April 18, 1980, the British flag was lowered, the Zimbabwean flag raised, and after 90 years of colonial rule, a new nation was formally born.
The big question mark is whether Mr. Nkomo, the erstwhile father of Zimbabwe, will settle for a minor role in the new government. A powerful force in Zimbabwean affairs, Mr. Nkomo has so far shown great restraint. He has used his influence to maintain the spirit of peace and unity.
Will take your part in rebuilding of Zimbabwe. When I say everyone, I mean everybody, including those people against.
We have got, all of us.
We cannot build Zimbabwe if we do not. Now, all of us join in as one nation without any distinction of color or creed.
However, the ballot did not dissolve wartime rivalries. It merely relocated them into the state, and within 3 years, those unresolved political and ethnic tensions would erupt into mass killings, revealing how independence had ended colonial rule, yet failed to end the violence born of the liberation struggle itself. From 1983 to 1987, Zimbabwe witnessed a campaign of mass violence that targeted primarily the Ndebele population and supporters of Nkomo's Zimbabwe African People's Union. The term Gukurahundi signaled intent to cleanse. What followed were detentions, torture, and executions on a vast scale. The crackdown was carried out by the North Korean-trained 5th Brigade of the Zimbabwe National Army, which was deployed across Matabeleland North, South, and the Midlands. Over 2 years, thousands of civilians, Ndebele and Kalanga in particular, were detained, brutalized, and killed. Though estimates vary, the Catholic Commission for Justice and Peace is said to have confirmed at least 2,750 deaths, while others argue it was more. Seen in sequence, the line from Chitepo's assassination to the hunt for Nkomo to Gukurahundi becomes clear. It traces how colonial wartime methods, suspicion, surveillance, elimination, were absorbed into African state power. What began as a struggle against colonial rule ended, for many, as a struggle for survival under a new flag. And once again, the arc would circle back to Zambia, not as a battlefield, but as the last refuge of dialogue when violence threatened to consume the cause it claimed to serve. In the wake of threats on leaders and widening fractures in the liberation movement, President Kaunda and the Zambian government assumed the burden of mediator and guarantor, convening rival nationalist leaders in Lusaka in a final bid to arrest self-destruction and restore strategic unity. Time and again, President Kaunda opened Lusaka to men who no longer trusted one another, believing that liberation without unity would only trade colonial domination for internal ruin. The Lusaka Unity Accord of 1974 was one such intervention, fragile, contested, and imperfect. But it revealed Zambia's conviction that reconciliation was not a luxury of peace, but a prerequisite for victory. Even when assassinations, mutinies, and rivalries undermined the agreement, the principle endured.
Zambia is obviously host, and as chairman, I can only say that Zambia's task will not be to reconcile various stands on the issues, but to see that various points of view have a fair hearing, and in the end to enable leaders to reconcile their views. Zambia will not have the task of reconciling views. Zambia will have the task of chairing meetings, and leaders themselves reconcile their views.
All in all, in the end, the outcomes were mixed. Yet through it all, from Chitepo's assassination to the hunt for Nkomo to the massacres that followed Zimbabwe's independence, Zambia's role was a constant attempt to turn confrontation into reconciliation and dialogue. And when one looks back at this rather tragic chapter in Southern African history, one truth remains, and that is, the liberation struggle may have won the war, but it was reconciliation that saved nations. And even then, it required courage, not only to fight, but to forgive.